I did not realize how completely a person could disappear until the night I was told to stay in the kitchen, not asked, not gently guided, placed there like something useful but unseen, while laughter filled the room I used to belong to. My own home had become unfamiliar, and my silence was mistaken for surrender. What they did not understand was that wounds like that do not fade. They settle, they sharpen, and sometimes they wake something that has been patient for far too long. This is the story of what happens when being overlooked becomes the most dangerous mistake of all. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 72 years old, a widow, a retired accountant, and the kind of woman people stop seeing long before they stop needing her. I live in a house overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Monterey, California, where the air always smells faintly of salt and eucalyptus, and the mornings arrive wrapped in a pale, forgiving light. I have lived in this house for more than 4 decades, though lately I have begun to feel like a guest who has overstayed her welcome. My husband, Thomas, bought the house in the early 1980s, back when the coastline was quieter and no one called it prime real estate. We raised our son Ethan here. We painted the walls ourselves, argued about tile samples, tracked every dollar that went into the mortgage. I kept the books, as I always had. I knew what we owed, what we earned, and what we could survive. Thomas trusted me with that completely. He used to say the house stood because I made the numbers behave. When Thomas passed away, the house did not change. I did. I learned how silence settles into rooms, how certain chairs remain empty even when no one mentions them. Still, I managed. I paid the taxes, maintained the property, and watched the neighborhood grow shinier and louder around me. I would have stayed alone here indefinitely if life had not nudged me in another direction. After a minor surgery, Ethan insisted I move in with him and his wife, Lauren. He framed it as concern, as practicality, as family doing what family does. I agreed, not because I felt helpless, but because I believed him. I believed that sharing a roof again might feel like continuity rather than retreat. Lauren had other ideas for the house. She was a designer, and she treated the place like a blank canvas that had waited far too long for her arrival. Within weeks, familiar furniture disappeared. Walls were repainted in muted tones, meant to photograph well. Decorative objects that had once held stories were boxed up and labeled outdated. I watched the transformation quietly, telling myself that styles change, that houses adapt the way people do. Ethan stayed busy. He left early, came home late, and learned to answer most questions with distraction. Lauren managed the space, the schedule, and eventually the atmosphere. I adjusted without complaint. I folded myself into smaller routines, avoided rooms that no longer felt like mine, and learned when to retreat upstairs with a book before the house filled with guests. There were moments when I caught my reflection in the glass doors facing the ocean and barely recognized the woman standing there. I was still inside the same walls, still sleeping beneath the same roof, but something essential had shifted. Ownership had become a concept rather than a feeling. Familiarity had been replaced by permission. My granddaughter Emily drifted through the house like a soft echo. She was observant, quieter than her parents, and careful in the way children become when they sense tension they do not yet know how to name. Sometimes she would sit near me without speaking, as if proximity alone might be a kind of reassurance. At night, when the house finally settled, I would listen to the waves rolling in below the bluff. The sound reminded me of the years when this place was ours in every sense that mattered. I was not angry then. I was simply aware. A house can stand exactly where it always has and still no longer belong to you, and that realization, more than age or illness, was the first true fracture. If you're still watching and you can already feel how something is quietly shifting beneath the surface, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Because what looks like patience right now is about to turn into awareness. Now let's move on to chapter 2. Christmas morning arrived quietly, wrapped in a pale coastal fog that softened the edges of the world outside our windows. The ocean below the bluff moved with its usual patience, indifferent to holidays, schedules, or the fragile expectations people bring into a single day. I woke early, as I always did, and sat for a while listening to the house come alive around me, doors opening, footsteps moving with purpose, the low hum of anticipation. Lauren had planned everything down to the smallest detail. The decorations followed a strict blend of whites and muted golds, chosen, I suspected, not for warmth, but for how they would look in photographs. The tree stood perfectly symmetrical near the glass doors, its ornaments spaced with mathematical precision. There was no trace of the mismatched decorations Ethan had once made in elementary school, no handmade ornaments, no evidence that this holiday had ever belonged to children or memory rather than presentation. In years past, Christmas had been my domain. I cooked, organized, adjusted, and quietly made sure everyone felt accounted for. I remembered which guests preferred dark meat, who disliked nutmeg, who needed an extra blanket by the fire. I had thought those instincts would fade when I stepped back, but instead they lingered, unused, like muscles no longer asked to work. By late afternoon, the house filled with people. Voices layered over one another. Coats were draped carefully over furniture I no longer recognized as familiar, and the air took on the scent of wine and citrus. I stayed near the edge of it all, aware of my place shifting with each arrival. No one asked where I preferred to sit. No one asked what I needed. It happened without ceremony. Lauren passed me in the hallway, arms full, eyes already focused on something else. She told me, calmly and efficiently, that it would be easier if I stayed in the kitchen, that I could help from there, that it would be more comfortable. The words themselves were unremarkable. It was the assumption beneath them that landed with weight. Ethan was nearby. He heard. He did not intervene. His silence felt deliberate, a decision made long before that moment. I realized then that this arrangement had been agreed upon without me, that my role had been reduced quietly, efficiently, without confrontation. The kitchen was brightly lit, but strangely detached from the rest of the house. From there, I could hear laughter spilling from the living room, the clink of glasses, the rise and fall of conversation. I could see fragments through the doorway, glimpses of the faces turned toward one another, bodies angled inward. No one looked my way. I stood at the counter for a moment, unsure what I was meant to do. There was nothing to prepare, nothing that required my attention. Eventually, I sat. The chair felt temporary, as if it had been placed there to solve a problem rather than welcome a person. As the evening unfolded, I became an observer of my own family. I noticed how Lauren moved easily through the room, how Ethan followed her lead, how the guests responded to the version of the house she presented as her own. I felt something settle inside me, not sharp or dramatic, but cold and precise. I was not angry. Anger would have required surprise. What I felt instead was clarity. Being sent into the kitchen was not about convenience or help. It was about placement, about deciding where I belonged. Listening to the ocean beyond the glass, I understood that something essential had shifted. If I no longer had a seat at the table, then I needed to understand why. And more importantly, I needed to remember what exactly was still mine. If that moment in the kitchen hit closer to home than you expected, comment number 2 below. What seems like a small dismissal is often the first crack in something much bigger. Let's continue to chapter 3. The days after Christmas felt strangely hollow, as though the house itself had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe back in. The decorations remained in place, but without the guests, they seemed performative, frozen in a moment that no longer existed. I moved through the rooms quietly, careful not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled in after the holiday had passed. It was during one of those ordinary mornings that I noticed the first irregularity. A piece of mail sat on the entry table, turned face down, its return address partially obscured. It was from the bank. I recognized the logo instantly, the way one recognizes an old acquaintance across a crowded room. For years, every letter from them had come directly to me. That had been the arrangement, unspoken but absolute. This one had not. I did not open it right away. Instead, I carried it to the kitchen, set it on the counter, and made myself tea. Old habits die slowly. When I finally read it, my pulse remained steady, but something in my chest tightened. The letter referenced a recent inquiry regarding the property. Not a statement, not a routine notice, an inquiry. The language was careful, professional, and incomplete in a way that suggested someone had tried to begin a process they could not finish. Later that afternoon, I overheard part of a conversation Lauren was having in the living room. I did not mean to listen, but when you live in a house long enough, you learn which walls carry sound. She spoke in the brisk, polished tone she used with vendors and clients, asking questions that circled around valuation, timing, and flexibility. The moment she noticed me standing in the doorway, the call ended. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. That evening, I sat alone and thought about the way Ethan and Lauren had been moving through the house lately. The casual confidence, the assumptions layered into their decisions. I had mistaken it for ambition, for momentum. Now I recognized it as something else. They were behaving like people who believed the outcome had already been decided. For most of my adult life, I had been responsible for details no one else wanted to track. Numbers, dates, clauses buried at the bottom of pages. I remembered every form I had signed, every document I had refused to sign, every contingency we had built into our plans. Thomas had trusted me to keep us steady. I had not forgotten how. I retrieved the old file box from the back of my closet that night. It had not been touched in years. Inside were neatly labeled folders, each one a small record of decisions made carefully and deliberately. When I found the documents related to the house, I felt the quiet confirmation settle over me. The structure had never changed. Ownership had never transferred. Authority had never shifted. Any major action involving the house still required my signature. The realization did not bring satisfaction or relief. It brought clarity. The way Lauren and Ethan had been behaving suddenly made sense. They were moving forward under the assumption that I was no longer relevant, that time and proximity had rendered me passive. They believed I had already stepped aside. I said nothing. I asked no questions. I returned the papers to their place and closed the box. Silence, I understood now, could be a tool as precise as any contract. The fracture was not visible yet, but it had formed. And for the first time since Christmas, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was watching it unfold with intention. If you're still watching and starting to sense that silence can hide more power than anyone realizes, comment number 3 below to let me know you're still here, because this discovery changes everything. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. January settled into the house with a different weight than December had carried. The decorations were taken down, boxed neatly and labeled in Lauren's careful handwriting, but the atmosphere they left behind did not lift with them. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm, though it no longer felt shared. We occupied the same rooms, followed the same routines, and yet moved along separate lines that rarely intersected. I chose a morning when Ethan lingered over his coffee, his jacket still draped across the back of the chair, his phone mercifully silent for once. I did not bring up Christmas. I did not mention the letter from the bank or the conversation I had overheard. Instead, I spoke to him the way I always had when he was starting something new, when the stakes were high and the margins thin. I reminded him of the years when he first began investing, when he asked me questions about risk and leverage, when he trusted my judgment without hesitation. He listened politely, nodding in the way people do when they believe they already know the ending of the story. When I paused, he smiled and reassured me that everything was under control, that Lauren had a handle on the details now, that I did not need to worry about the house or anything else. His tone was gentle, almost indulgent, and that was what made it land so heavily. The conversation ended without conflict, but also without acknowledgement. I had spoken, and yet nothing I said had been received. After that, I stopped trying to initiate moments that required his attention. I began to notice instead how often Lauren referred to the house in possessive terms when speaking with friends or contractors. It was always our place, our investment, our plans. She spoke with an ease that suggested permanence, as though the matter had long been settled. When she reorganized the small office that had once been mine, she did not ask what should stay or go. Papers were stacked, sorted, and relocated with an efficiency that left no room for sentiment. I considered addressing it directly. There were moments when the words lined up neatly in my mind, calm and factual, ready to be spoken, but each time I recognized the futility of that approach. This was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected with explanation. It was a shift in power that had already taken place, reinforced by routine and silence. So I turned inward. In the evenings, when the house quieted, I returned to my records. I reviewed documents I knew by heart, checking dates, signatures, and contingencies. I traced the path of decisions made years ago when Thomas and I planned not just for comfort, but for uncertainty. The work steadied me. It reminded me who I had been long before anyone decided I was no longer relevant. There was a peculiar clarity in accepting that the role I had tried to maintain no longer existed. The mother who smoothed over conflicts, who filled in gaps without being asked, who believed patience would eventually be rewarded, had reached the end of her usefulness in this household. Continuing in that role would not restore balance. It would only confirm their assumptions. By the end of the month, I had stopped seeking conversation that led nowhere. I did not correct Lauren when she made plans that excluded me. I did not remind Ethan of promises he no longer remembered making. Instead, I observed, I prepared. I allowed them the comfort of believing that I had receded into the background entirely. The quiet attempts had failed, but they had also answered the last question I needed resolved. There would be no reconciliation through understanding, no return to a shared center. What lay ahead would require a different language altogether, one spoken not in appeals or explanations, but in decisions that could not be ignored. If you're still with me and you felt the weight of that quiet realization, comment number 4 below. This is the moment where waiting ends and preparation begins. Let's move forward into Chapter 5. February arrived without ceremony, bringing with it a sharper light and a kind of clarity that winter sometimes offers when it has finished pretending to be gentle. One evening, as I was setting a book back on the shelf, I noticed unfamiliar cars lining the drive. Their presence felt intentional, aligned the way people arrive when there is a purpose waiting for them inside. The house sounded different that night. Voices carried with a measured confidence, not the casual overlap of guests, but the focused cadence of people discussing outcomes. I stayed where I was, just beyond the main room, close enough to hear fragments without being seen. The conversation moved easily through terms I had not heard spoken aloud in years, words tied to leverage and timing, to opportunity and exposure. The tone was not speculative. It was settled, rehearsed. Ethan stood near the window, gesturing toward the ocean as if the view itself were part of the pitch. Lauren moved through the room with practiced ease, offering drinks, smoothing transitions, speaking about the house as though it were already an instrument rather than a place to live. There was no hesitation in her voice when she referenced the property, no acknowledgement that anyone else might have a stake in what was being discussed. I listened long enough to understand what they were attempting. The house was not just a backdrop to their plans, it was central to them. It was being positioned quietly, carefully, as collateral for something larger. Not officially, not yet, but with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the final obstacle has already been removed. That was the moment something in me shifted from restraint to resolve. I thought of Thomas then, of how carefully we had drawn lines between ambition and security. He had believed in taking risks, but never at the cost of stability. The house had been sacred to him, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. It was the one asset we agreed would never be leveraged beyond repair. Watching Ethan stand there, so certain, so removed from that principle, felt like witnessing a quiet betrayal that had been years in the making. I did not interrupt. I did not announce myself or challenge what I was hearing. Instead, I paid attention. I noted the names that surfaced, the way Lauren referred to timelines, the ease with which Ethan nodded along. This was not an impulsive conversation. It was the continuation of a plan already in motion. When the meeting ended, the guests left with the same purposeful efficiency they had arrived. The house returned to its usual hush, but the silence no longer felt passive. It felt charged. I waited until the lights dimmed and the doors closed before moving. Back in my room, I sat at the small desk and wrote down what I had heard, not out of fear but out of habit. Documentation had always been my anchor. Seeing the facts arranged plainly on the page stripped them of their ambiguity. The picture they formed was unmistakable. I understood then that my silence had been misinterpreted. It had allowed them to believe that the lines I once guarded had dissolved. That assumption, more than the plan itself, was the true fracture. They were no longer acting around me. They were acting as though I did not exist. That night, I did not sleep easily, not because I felt threatened, but because I felt resolved. The house had crossed from being a shared memory into contested ground, and once that line was crossed, there was no obligation left to preserve the illusion of peace. The house settled back into its familiar quiet after the meeting, but I no longer mistook silence for peace. It felt staged now, like a pause built into a longer sequence. I moved through my days with care, listening for what was said and for what was avoided, noting how easily Ethan and Lauren returned to their routines as if nothing consequential had occurred. At night, when the ocean pressed its steady rhythm against the shore, I considered the paths available to me. I knew them well enough to name them without effort. I could confront them directly, lay out what I had heard, demand explanations, and insist on restraint. I could also step aside entirely, sign whatever papers they placed in front of me, and remove myself from the equation with the dignity of quiet withdrawal. Both options carried the promise of immediate resolution, and both felt wrong. Confrontation would invite denial. It would become a discussion about intent rather than impact, about misunderstanding rather than boundary. I had watched Lauren navigate conversations like that before, redirecting them until the original concern dissolved into tone and emotion. I would leave the room framed as difficult, emotional, unreasonable. The substance would never be addressed. Withdrawal, on the other hand, would preserve surface harmony at a deeper cost. It would allow the house to be used in ways Thomas and I had explicitly agreed to avoid. It would turn years of careful planning into a convenience for someone else's ambition. I would still be complicit, even in absence. That left the third option, the one I had avoided considering for as long as possible. It required precision rather than persuasion, timing rather than appeal. It would not ask for understanding. It would enforce a boundary. I took out the trust documents late one evening and read them slowly, though I knew their contents by heart. Thomas and I had created the trust years ago, not out of suspicion, but out of foresight. We had seen how quickly circumstances could change, how easily values could erode when opportunity appeared. The language was clear, careful, and deliberately firm. The house was protected not just from creditors or markets, but from misuse born of overreach. There it was, exactly as I remembered. If the property were leveraged or positioned without the full consent of the designated authority, the trust allowed for immediate intervention. No negotiation, no warning, just action. I closed the folder and sat with the weight of that knowledge. This was not a decision to be made lightly, and I did not pretend otherwise. I understood what would follow. Shock, anger, accusations of betrayal. I would be told I had gone too far, that I had overreacted, that I had embarrassed the family. Those responses were predictable. They no longer held power over me. What mattered was that I could no longer protect a version of family that depended on my erasure. The cost of being agreeable had become too high. Choosing not to act would be a decision in itself, one that would echo long after the house changed hands in ways I could not reverse. I did not announce my choice. I did not seek counsel from those who would try to soften it. I made it privately, with clarity and without regret. There are moments when the need to be understood must give way to the need to be exact. By the time I returned the documents to their place, I felt steady, not triumphant, not vengeful, just resolved. Whatever followed would be shaped by facts rather than feelings. And once that threshold was crossed, there would be no returning to the version of myself who waited quietly to be considered. If you're still watching and you understand how dangerous a clear decision can be, comment number 6 below so I know you're ready for what comes next. Because choices have consequences, and Chapter 7 is where they begin to surface. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet inevitability. Nothing dramatic announced itself at first. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no sudden confrontations that marked the moment when everything changed. Instead, the shift revealed itself in subtler ways, in pauses where certainty used to live, in conversations that lost their momentum halfway through. Ethan began coming home later than usual, his movements sharper, his attention fractured. He spent more time on the phone, pacing the length of the living room with a tension he did not bother to disguise. Lauren, who once moved through the house with effortless authority, started checking her messages more frequently, rereading emails as though the meaning might rearrange itself if she looked hard enough. Something they had expected to proceed smoothly was no longer doing so. I watched all of this without comment, not out of satisfaction, but out of necessity. This was no longer the moment for reassurance or explanation. Whatever mechanisms had been set in motion were doing precisely what they were designed to do, pressing gently but firmly against the edges of their assumptions. The first sign came in the form of hesitation from the outside world. Meetings were postponed. Calls that had once been returned within hours stretched into days. The confidence that had filled the house in early February began to thin, replaced by a cautious uncertainty neither Ethan nor Lauren could quite name. They spoke in lower voices now, careful with their words, as though aware that something unseen was listening. Lauren attempted to regain control through order. She reorganized spaces that did not need rearranging, adjusted schedules that had worked perfectly well before. Control, I understood, was her way of managing fear. When it no longer produced the expected results, her frustration surfaced in small involuntary gestures, a tightened jaw, a sharper exhale, an edge to her movements that had not been there before. I began sorting through my belongings during the quieter afternoons, not because I planned to leave, but because I needed to be clear about what mattered to me. I separated objects with real meaning from those that had simply accumulated over time. Each decision felt like a quiet acknowledgement that the life I had been living in this house had already ended, regardless of whether I stayed or went. There were moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly, not for the house itself, but for the version of my son I thought I knew. Accepting that Ethan had chosen ambition over restraint, convenience over consideration, required a kind of mourning I had not anticipated. It was painful, but it was also clarifying. Illusions, once released, no longer demand maintenance. Lauren eventually noticed the change in my behavior. She asked, lightly, if everything was all right. The question was performative, designed to elicit reassurance rather than truth. I answered simply, offering nothing for her to push against. Silence, once again, did its work. By the end of the month, the atmosphere in the house had shifted completely. The ease they once carried had given way to vigilance. They were reacting now, not directing. They did not yet understand why, but they felt the loss of control all the same. I knew then that the consequences had begun to surface. What happened next would no longer be contained within the walls of this house or the dynamics of this family. The choices made in private were reaching outward, touching systems and structures far larger than any of us. And once those systems responded, there would be no returning to the comfort of assumption. Once the tension in the house became impossible to ignore, my attention began to drift elsewhere. Ethan and Lauren were consumed by their own unraveling, caught in a loop of calls, meetings, and whispered conversations that never quite resolved. I no longer felt the need to track their moods or anticipate their reactions. For the first time in months, my thoughts were not organized around surviving the atmosphere they created. They were organized around what came next. I spent long mornings walking through the house with fresh eyes. I noticed how the light shifted from room to room, how the sound of the ocean softened the sharper edges of silence. This place had always adapted to change. It had held young voices, grief, routine, and celebration without losing its center. The problem had never been the house itself. It was the way it had been reduced to a tool, stripped of meaning and pressed into service for ambitions that had nothing to do with shelter or care. Ethan began coming home later than usual, his movements sharper, his attention fractured. He spent more time on the phone, pacing the length of the living room with a tension he did not bother to disguise. Lauren, who once moved through the house with effortless authority, started checking her messages more frequently, rereading emails as though the meaning might rearrange itself if she looked hard enough. Something they had expected to proceed smoothly was no longer doing so. I watched all of this without comment, not out of satisfaction, but out of necessity. This was no longer the moment for reassurance or explanation. Whatever mechanisms had been set in motion were doing precisely what they were designed to do, pressing gently but firmly against the edges of their assumptions. The first sign came in the form of hesitation from the outside world. Meetings were postponed. Calls that had once been returned within hours stretched into days. The confidence that had filled the house in early February began to thin, replaced by a cautious uncertainty neither Ethan nor Lauren could quite name. They spoke in lower voices now, careful with their words, as though aware that something unseen was listening. Lauren attempted to regain control through order. She reorganized spaces that did not need rearranging, adjusted schedules that had worked perfectly well before. Control, I understood, was her way of managing fear. When it no longer produced the expected results, her frustration surfaced in small, involuntary gestures, a tightened jaw, a sharper exhale, an edge to her movements that had not been there before. I began sorting through my belongings during the quieter afternoons, not because I planned to leave, but because I needed to be clear about what mattered to me. I separated objects with real meaning from those that had simply accumulated over time. Each decision felt like a quiet acknowledgement that the life I had been living in this house had already ended, regardless of whether I stayed or went. There were moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly, not for the house itself, but for the version of my son I thought I knew. Accepting that Ethan had chosen ambition over restraint, convenience over consideration, required a kind of mourning I had not anticipated. It was painful, but it was also clarifying. Illusions, once released, no longer demand maintenance. Lauren eventually noticed the change in my behavior. She asked, lightly, if everything was all right. The question was performative, designed to elicit reassurance rather than truth. I answered simply, offering nothing for her to push against. Silence, once again, did its work. By the end of the month, the atmosphere in the house had shifted completely. The ease they once carried had given way to vigilance. They were reacting now, not directing. They did not yet understand why, but they felt the loss of control all the same. I knew then that the consequences had begun to surface. What happened next would no longer be contained within the walls of this house or the dynamics of this family. The choices made in private were reaching outward, touching systems and structures far larger than any of us. And once those systems responded, there would be no returning to the comfort of assumption. Once the tension in the house became impossible to ignore, my attention began to drift elsewhere. Ethan and Lauren were consumed by their own unraveling, caught in a loop of calls, meetings, and whispered conversations that never quite resolved. I no longer felt the need to track their moods or anticipate their reactions. For the first time in months, my thoughts were not organized around surviving the atmosphere they created. They were organized around what came next. I spent long mornings walking through the house with fresh eyes. I noticed how the light shifted from room to room, how the sound of the ocean softened the sharper edges of silence. This place had always adapted to change. It had held young voices, grief, routine, and celebration without losing its center. The problem had never been the house itself. It was the way it had been reduced to a tool, stripped of meaning and pressed into service for ambitions that had nothing to do with shelter or care. I consulted my lawyer quietly, asking questions framed around possibility rather than conflict. The answers came back measured and reassuring. What I was envisioning was not only feasible, it aligned with the intent Thomas and I had built into our planning. The trust had never been meant to preserve comfort at the expense of conscience. As the idea solidified, I felt something loosen inside me. The weight I had been carrying since Christmas began to lift, replaced by a steadier sense of direction. This was not about reclaiming control from Ethan and Lauren. It was about stepping out of a story that no longer fit and writing one that did. Standing in the room that faced the ocean, I imagined voices returning to the house in a different way. Conversations that did not require performance. Lives that had been narrowed by neglect expanding again, slowly, deliberately. The house had given me a great deal over the years. It felt right to let it give something back. For the first time since I had been sent into the kitchen, I felt fully present again, not as a mother waiting to be acknowledged, but as a woman choosing what mattered. Whatever followed would be shaped by this decision, and for once, the shape felt honest. If you're still here, and you're wondering how all of this finally comes together, comment number 8 below. The ending is closer than you think, and the final chapters will change the meaning of everything you've heard so far. Let's move toward the conclusion. By early spring, The house no longer answered to the rhythms it once followed. The change did not arrive with fanfare or announcements. It came through small, unmistakable signs that something permanent had settled into place. The paperwork was complete. The trust had done what it was designed to do. The house by the water was no longer a private asset balanced on ambition. It had become harbor haven in both name and function. The first mornings after the transition felt unfamiliar, but not uneasy. I woke to the same ocean light, the same steady sound of waves, yet the air inside the house carried a different intention. Rooms that once held tension now held quiet purpose. I moved through them without the careful calculation that had governed my steps for months. There was nothing left to anticipate or defend against. Ethan and Lauren did not speak about what had happened, not directly. Their lives adjusted around the absence of control rather than confronting it. Plans dissolved. Assumptions unraveled. They continued to live nearby, though not under this roof. When I saw them, which was infrequent, the distance between us felt settled rather than raw. Something essential had been lost, but it had been lost long before the house changed hands. I did not experience triumph. That emotion belongs to contests, and this had never been one. What I felt instead was a steady sense of alignment. For the first time since Thomas died, the house reflected my values without negotiation. It existed for stability, not leverage. For presence, not performance. The women who arrived at Harbor Haven came quietly. One carried a single suitcase and a lifetime of habits shaped around being careful not to ask for too much. Another arrived with stacks of paperwork she no longer understood, eyes wary from years of being spoken over. I welcomed them without ceremony. There was no need to explain why they were here. They understood instinctively. The house adjusted to them easily. The kitchen filled with conversation again, not loud or rehearsed, but real. The dining table, long reduced to a backdrop, became a place where people lingered. There was laughter, but it was not curated. There was silence too, but it did not feel like exclusion. It felt like rest. I watched this transformation without inserting myself at its center. Harbor Haven did not need a figurehead. It needed consistency, boundaries, and care. I provided those quietly, the same way I always had when things mattered most. Occasionally, I thought of Ethan as a child, running through these rooms with the reckless certainty that the world would always catch him. I wondered when that certainty had turned into entitlement, when security had begun to look like something to be used rather than protected. Those thoughts passed without bitterness. Understanding does not require forgiveness, only clarity. One afternoon, I stood on the back deck and looked out at the water. The tide was low, exposing the darkened rocks beneath the surface. It struck me that endings often look like loss until you see what remains. The house was quieter now, but it was no longer tense. It held stories again, not curated narratives, but lives unfolding without apology. This was not the ending I would have chosen years ago. It was, however, the one that made sense. The house had outgrown the family that tried to confine it. In doing so, it had given me something I had not realized I was missing. Not vindication, but peace. In the early mornings before Harbor Haven fully wakes, the house settles into a kind of honesty I have come to recognize. The ocean breathes steadily beyond the windows, the light slips across the floors without asking permission, and for a brief stretch of time, nothing is required of me except presence. It is in these moments that I understand what has truly changed. I used to believe that my worth was tied to how quietly I could carry a family, how much I could absorb without complaint. I mistook endurance for virtue and patience for purpose. For years, I measured my success by how little space I occupied, by how easily I could be folded into the background while others moved forward. That version of me believed that love, if given long enough, would eventually circle back. It does not always work that way. Being sent into the kitchen that Christmas was not the injury itself. It was the revelation. It showed me how thoroughly I had been edited out of the picture I once helped create. What followed was not a battle to reclaim a seat at a table that no longer valued me. It was a reckoning with the idea that I had outgrown the need to be invited at all. In the early mornings, before Harbor Haven fully wakes, the house settles into a kind of honesty I have come to recognize. The ocean breathes steadily beyond the windows. The light slips across the floors without asking permission, and for a brief stretch of time, nothing is required of me except presence. It is in these moments that I understand what has truly changed. I used to believe that my worth was tied to how quietly I could carry a family, how much I could absorb without complaint. I mistook endurance for virtue and patience for purposes. For years, I measured my success by how little space I occupied, by how easily I could be folded into the background while others moved forward. That version of me believed that love, if given long enough, would eventually circle back. It does not always work that way. Being sent into the kitchen that Christmas was not the injury itself. It was the revelation. It showed me how thoroughly I had been edited out of the picture I once helped create. What followed was not a battle to reclaim a seat at a table that no longer valued me. It was a reckoning with the idea that I had outgrown the need to be invited at all.